So, why are we obsessed with superheroes? Are they modern gods? Or is there something more to it going on than just that? Today we're going to explore the popular figure of the superhero and what it may represent. So there's countless variations of superhero stories that have been around forever, but the genre really exploded in the early part of the 20th century with the medium and the invention of the medium of comic books. And that's really where it found its legs. And since then, there's been all sorts of superhero stories, and they've always been considered somewhat lowbrow, but they're very popular nonetheless, and they're still with us. And I think you could make the argument that they're not really considered as lowbrow as they used to be, considering that movie studios are willing to spend millions and millions of dollars, and serious art critics now weigh in on the quality of these stories. So, so what's up with that? What's going on with this? Now, I could go on a deep dive into the lore of comic book heroes and ancient superheroes, and that would just take us way too far afield. So I'm going to try to narrow the focus down to one particular example, so I can kind of highlight what I think is going on here psychologically, and why the imagination is being used in the manner that it is to create these sorts of stories, and why do they connect with people. I'm going to use the example of the Justice League, mainly in honor of the recently released so-called Snyder Cut of the Justice League. It's a 4-hour-long extravaganza of DC superheroes. I'm a big fan myself. I want to officially go on board as saying hashtag restore the Snyderverse. Just saying. I thought it was a huge improvement over the 2017 movie. So let's take a look at these characters and how Zack Snyder and his writers took the existing material that had been built up over decades and then crafted it into a coherent story about these characters in the Justice League. So just to recap here now, the Justice League consists of the biggies, right? Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. But then they also add Aquaman and Cyborg and the Flash. So these guys come together very briefly. Spoiler alert. They come together to fight this character named Steppenwolf, who's a big bad guy from a place called Apocalypse. It's all completely absurd and totally over the top. And yet it's a lot of fun. And I do believe that there's something deeper going on here with the human emotions and the way that these things are depicted. If you look at them the way that I look at dreams, in other words, that they are fantastical because they are using this fantastical imagery to represent something deeper and emotional going on that actually connects to something real within the human psyche. If you look at it that way, you can start to see certain types of patterns emerge, and they're pretty interesting. Now, one of the things that you can definitely see in the Justice League is that every single one of the characters in the Justice League is marked by early trauma and abandonment, sometimes both. Trauma and abandonment, sometimes just one or the other. But in addition to that, you also see this conflict that they have with identity loss. At the beginning of the stories, they don't know who they are, how they fit in, what they're supposed to be, and then by the end of the story, they tend to have found that in general. And even with established characters that have had previous movies like Wonder Woman and Superman, the new version of the Justice League brings a new challenge that are basically still along those same lines. Well, isn't that interesting? But is it unique to modern superhero stories? Partially. And I'm going to give you an example. Now, of course, superheroes have been around forever. There's always been stories of superhuman feats. They weren't always called superheroes, but you could take characters like the Irish Cuchulainn. You could take other characters like Beowulf. These are characters who they're human, but they're better than everybody else at one or the other thing. And so they really stand apart. But they're not gods. They're not immortal. They can die. They frequently do die. And so they kind of blend characteristics of the divine and the human, but not in the way that, say, a demigod might, like Heracles. So now there is some blur and some overlap there, and even the modern superheroes have that blurriness to them, especially, particularly with Wonder Woman and Superman. But Wonder Woman is thousands of years old. She was created by Zeus, so she's very much a demigod, at least in her current iteration. And that's another thing about superheroes is which version are we looking at? Are we looking at when they were created or what they look like now? Because they have changed over the years. But I would argue, and maybe this is a good subject for another video, that they change, but they move towards a certain endpoint and they don't change after that. And there are certain features of these superheroes that have not changed even from the very beginning. So like Batman's origin story, for example, has not changed over the years. So that's something that has stuck, right? So that's a resonant feature. It's very sticky. Other things get added or subtracted, but then they kind of gravitate back towards the resonant features of those characters. Okay, so in the current versions of the Justice League characters, Superman and Wonder Woman are both very close to demigods. You could argue that the Aquaman is way up there too. But that's not really the point. The point is that there is enough humanity to them that something like early trauma, abandonment, and identity loss still kind of makes sense. It doesn't make much sense for that to affect a god. So you're not going to have a story about a deity who has these problems. It just doesn't, it's not going to make much sense. On the other hand, if you have a superhero, has got some of the cool features of deities, but they're human enough to where I can relate. But they always seem to have the same kind of issues. And that's what's interesting about the Justice League, is that all of these characters have this issue of early trauma, abandonment, and separation, as well as identity problems. Let's take them all one by one here. So in this version, Aquaman is definitely got an identity loss. He doesn't know where he belongs. He's a part of both worlds. So his mother left him on the shore. His mother is an Atlantean. His father is human. All right, so there's that blend of the divine and the human again. Left on the shore, and he is now stuck in between the two worlds, and he doesn't like either one of them. Cyborg, very early trauma, and that he literally dies, and his mother is killed. His father brings him back to life with super technology, but he's now a robot. So he's stuck in between worlds, and he's not human, but he's not a robot. He's something in between. He doesn't know who he is. He's lost. Wonder Woman, she is a little bit more grounded than the rest of them in the terms of identity, but she still has the early trauma. She has the backstory of losing her true love, Steve Trevor. And again, she's also a member of two worlds. She was an Amazonian, which are a very superhuman race of female warriors, but she lives in the human world. And she is separate from the Amazon island of Themyscira. So she sometimes struggles with who am I as well. You have the Flash. Okay, so the Flash's father, he's marked by early trauma and separation as well. His father was thrown in prison for killing his mother, a crime he didn't commit, and so he's left to his own devices. And at the beginning of the story, in this particular version of the Justice League, they really try to emphasize Barry Allen's separation and identity problems. Like he's still having a hard time. Even the older version of this, with the kind of corny jokes about brunch, talks about him not feeling like he fits anywhere. And then in the Snyder version of this, they show this by how alone he really feels when he's zipping around and everybody else is in super ultra slow motion. So it shows us rather than tells us how lost he feels. All right, and then you've got Superman, who's probably got the biggest trauma of all of the characters, in that his entire species was completely wiped out, and he's the last member of of this, again, superhuman society of godlike beings. But he's got to live with humans, and he's got to figure out what is his place. Now, they've explored a lot of the identity stuff with the previous movies of this franchise, and in the comics, of course, they've explored this a lot. In fact, I don't think Superman would be nearly as interesting if it wasn't for the alter ego of Clark Kent, which is where he's literally walking around and just doing regular people stuff. But of course, the great irony and fun of these stories is that we all know that he's really Superman, and he could basically do whatever he wants to. So it's a Superman. I could do a whole video on him, just in the sense that his character is so ridiculously overpowered that what storytellers have done is really, it forces them to dive into his psyche, which is actually a whole lot more interesting, because he's got to balance this ultra super power with everyday human concerns. So it's a very heightened, hyper real way of depicting these inner conflicts that pretty much all of us have with ideals. Like, how am I supposed to live right and true? And these ideals are like Superman. They're invulnerable, they're eternal, they cannot be touched. And yet we somehow still have to try to make our way through them despite the grunt and sweat of a weary life, as Hamlet would say. Okay, so now, how do these characters, don't let me forget, Batman, how could I forget, right? So we all know his trauma and separation, very severe. Both parents gunned down right in front of him, on the street. Lots of trauma, lots of separation from the parents. And then, of course, he also himself struggles with the identity issue. Who am I? A lot of this is explored in the previous movies, the Batman versus Superman movie. Despite whatever you may think about it, it does at least try to dive into, what would it really be like for somebody like that? He's separated again by his great wealth. He's super rich, and this actually serves to isolate him from the rest of, everyday Joes. And so he's struggles with this who am I business as well. Okay, so every one of the characters in the Justice League is marked by early trauma, separation, and identity loss. Let's take a look now at a comparison between these guys and an ancient superhero. Okay, so Beowulf is the example I like to use. You guys may remember reading about Beowulf in the 10th grade or whatever. Just to kind of give you a reminder, he was a hero of the Geats, which is a tribe in early Sweden. And he goes on various adventures in Denmark, where he battles monsters, and eventually he becomes the king of the Geats. A dragon then conveniently shows up and threatens the kingdom, and he has to go out and fight the dragon. And when he does manage, with the help of a young captain, he does manage to kill the dragon, but it kills him, and he dies, and he's celebrated as a great king, and so forth. Now, he qualifies, in my definition, as a superhero because the poem goes out of its way to tell us just how super he is. He fights sea monsters for literally days on end underwater. He has the strength of 30 men in a single grip. He's bigger and taller and stronger than everybody else around him. He's super courageous. He alone, amongst the 12 companions that he takes with him to Grendel's Mere, dives in by himself to face Grendel's mother, who is a horrendous, vicious monster. And so he does have superhuman abilities, but he's still human. He can die. And of course, in many of these ancient superhero stories, we eventually get to the point where the character does die. Now, I would argue that you tend to see that more often when a culture is in transition and you're starting to look at the heroes of the past and the poems and the bards and what have you of the day, which would correspond with our current modern day movie screenwrites and playwrights and so forth, would look to the past and say, okay, but that time is kind of over. So now let's put a cap on this and tell a story about the noble and honorable and fabulous way in which this guy died, so we can kind of immortalize him in that sense. So how does that connect, though? Well, Beowulf is also marked by early trauma and separation, but he's not marked by the identity loss, which is a really interesting um, contrast to the modern superheroes. Beowulf, his father is killed when he's at age 7. And this, of course, is traumatic and leaves him kind of at a loss. But very quickly after that, he is adopted by a local within the community, and he kind of connects with his grandfather, and he carries his grandfather's sword into battle later on, which is a very nice, concrete, tangible symbol of the connection to his lineage. He's well aware of his lineage. He knows how far back it goes and so forth. He's got a very strong identity as a Geat. And the Geats, that never escapes him. He always knows exactly who he is and where he belongs. But he does have the early trauma and that early separation from his father. His father ran off and got involved in a random dispute, and it wound up getting him killed. The poet tells us specifically that he was unwise and rash, but let's contrast that to Beowulf, who he shows us is not rash, and he only fights when it's absolutely necessary, and he's a very upstanding guy, unlike his father. Not only that, but he's given the chance to become king early on and declines that because he says, no, it's not my place. The lineage doesn't go to me. It goes to this young man over here, and I'll be his mentor. And that's exactly what he does. He mentors the younger man, who is the king, and then when that guy dies, then he is the next in line, and he ascends the throne as a much older man. But this solidifies his place within that identity as a Geatish warrior. So, unlike our modern superheroes in the Justice League, Beowulf has all of those characteristics. He's got the superhuman abilities, but he does not have the identity loss that our modern heroes do. But he does have the trauma and the early separation part. So that seems to be very ancient. It's the identity loss that's new. So what's up with that? Well, this is where we have to kind of get into speculation, because this is a new characteristic of these characters, and I believe that you can trace that to cultural changes. And over the 20th century, we have seen massive cultural changes. Of all of the different ethnicities and different groups that live in the United States, we'll just use us for an example here, since the Justice League is an American creation. After all, it used to be called the Justice League of America, so it tells you how old I am. I remember that. Anyway, so what's going on here? So in the ancient context in which Beowulf was written, which is about 1,000 years ago now, give or take, scholars aren't exactly sure when it was written, but it was definitely around 10th or 9th century. During that time frame, we had a very different culture than we do now. Now, what is different? Many things were the same, right? The emphasis on trauma and separation, everybody understood how bad that is. But what's going on now? Well, in modern culture, we have a gradual decrease of community ties and like long-term ethnic ties, which I think have changed quite a bit in comparison to the ancient culture. We've had an increasing emphasis on nuclear family. Various economic factors have separated families and spread them out all over the place. There's a lot of generational tension that you see. Now, that's not unique, again, to history, but I think to the degree that it is now might be. I would hope maybe some experts out there in sociology might help me out on that. We definitely experience a constant pressure to break away from the old and embrace the new. And part of that is encouraged by our massive changes in technology. And we have pressure to adapt to these new changes, but at the same time, there's the pull of keeping with tradition. And this is something I definitely see with my patients all the time, is this interplay between, I grew up in this household and they had all of this tradition and rules and all this stuff, but it doesn't work for me, so I'm having all this trouble because I have to break away from all of that. It causes family tension and so forth and so on. So there's a lot of that going on. Again, I don't think it's unique to modern America, but I think it may be much more common than it used to be. So what does that lead to? It leads to a common experience of identity loss. Now, it's something I see all the time, is part of a person's suffering surrounding the idea of, I don't know who I am, I don't know where I fit in, and the possibilities of our modern culture have exploded to such a huge degree that we have almost infinite choices, and in some ways that might be even worse than having no choice, depending on how you look at it. And I think you definitely see this much more pervasively, particularly in the middle class. In the lower class, you don't see it as much because they don't have as many options. They're very poor. You know, and then in the upper class, there's a whole lot of pressure to keep what you got. So that's a pressure that you're dealing with in terms of the weight of the past. In fact, the weight of the past, even just that saying, suggests that it's a terrible thing. We got to get rid of it. We got to shrug it off, right? So, and sometimes it is. But if we're always stuck in that, if so many people are stuck in that, then they have this dilemma, this identity issue. So how does that then translate into our obsession with superheroes? Well, fantastical storytelling of today, you can look at as if they were dreams of a culture. So the common themes that emerge, the emotional themes that emerge, will be depicted in symbolic fashion the same way that a dream would do it. So common pressures, very common issues, they're going to get morphed into stories that are very vivid, they're very over the top a lot of times, they're very memorable, and they are definitely going to be symbolic. So then does this help? Well, I think it could definitely help, because the end result of most of these stories, and Justice League included, is that the characters overcome these issues. The fact that they're super, you might argue, well, how does that relatable, right? I don't have super strength or super anything. Well, the super nature of it, the giving these characters superpowers, emphasizes their ideal nature, like the way that they represent ideals rather than actual people. But if you get too abstract with the idealization, then you end up with just deities, and you know, they're really the only thing you can do with them is to worship them, and not. You know, it's not like I can be them really. They're so far up there. They're just way too far way above our pay grade, right? So superheroes seems to be like a sweet spot where it's just not like every random schmo, right? They're exceptional, so they're worthy of attention, and it's their superpowers that garner the attention. It's flashy, you know. It's wow, look what they can do, you know. But then you give them relatable issues like that we all deal with. We all deal with, if we don't deal with separation, we deal with the fear of separation. That's human nature. If we don't have trauma, we can understand trauma. Trauma is always lurking out there, possible, you know. And if so many people have this identity problem, they don't know who they are or where they fit in, well, then they're going to feel that too. And they're going to really get invested in these super characters. Like if this person can figure out how to get through these things, maybe I can. So it's one way is to kind of promote hope. And a recent iteration of Superman says tells us that the symbol, and this is a retcon, but the symbol on his chest represents hope, and they're just being even more direct than the older versions. They're saying the S symbol means hope when it didn't originally, but now it does, and that's cool. They're just connecting it to the idea even more directly. So you take a character like this who has this very relatable issue, something that lots of people are dealing with. You tell it in this very bombastic, fantastical way. It's going to get attention. It's going to be flashy. It's going to be full of explosions. It's going to be fun. There's going to be an element of escapism. You know, like let's get away from the daily drudgery and the mundanity of everything and go into a fantastical world. But the foray into the fantastical world is not just for escape or wish fulfillment. It's about how do I depict this issue that I have in a concrete way so that I can understand it better and maybe have a way to deal with it. So that's what I think is going on with our obsession with superheroes. They connect with very common emotional issues. They do provide a little bit of hope. They take the characters and they run them through the ringer. They punish them, they pound, they hit them hard. In Superman's case, they even kill him, but he comes back. He comes back to life and learns that he has to relearn what his place is, and he has to go through the process again. Even Superman has to do this stuff, right? So that's another feature of this, right? Even Superman has to deal with this stuff. Well, then I shouldn't be too scared that I have to. Sure, he might be better equipped to deal with it, but you know, the challenges that Superman faces are proportionally escalated compared to what I have to deal with. So, you know, I can always look at that and go, well, at least I don't have to try to fight off an army of demons trying to take over the whole planet. He's like, well, yeah, but if you were Superman, you could probably handle that. Oh, okay, maybe so. But the bottom line being, though, is that we both have a common feature, right? Is that we're both trying to figure out how do I find my place in the world? How do I overcome the trauma and the separation? And how do I achieve victory and save the world? And a final note, we'll talk about that, saving the world business, right? So what's that about? The saving the world is so commonly found in this because the world in a fantastical story like this is the psyche as a whole. It's under threat. Trauma can threaten it. It can shatter us. It can break us down. So these forces, these external forces that are threatening to break us down, make us want to feel horrible or suicidal even, they're very real threats, and they feel as if the world is falling apart. So the superhero then represents the answer to those things. Within us, when the psyche is threatened by outside forces, then the psyche also produces defenses, and those defenses are represented by the superheroes. If we give them relatable human struggles and challenges, it makes it even more powerful. Thanks for watching.